and good to have you with us in this edition of the Urban Debate. Tonight we start with a big spotlight on black fungus, or the mucormycosis as it is known as, that is now very quickly spreading in more and more parts of India, with more and more cases being reported from the biggest of our states. The last we checked, over 20 states and counting had reported now cases of mucormycosis. The central government has asked the states to notify this disease under the Epidemic Diseases Act. 4 states have already gone ahead and done so and declared black fungus as an epidemic, which means that several of the norms and the rules and regulations on coordination and etc. which are there for epidemics will now come into play in these states. So tonight I decided that let's have a conversation one more time about all aspects of black fungus. Why is it spreading so much? What can we do? Will the states need dedicated hospitals? Do we have enough staff? The central government has given the nod to more companies to manufacture this drug, but how soon can those get to the market? What should be the things to watch out for as we now tackle this new disease? As an epidemic, there will be a multidisciplinary approach. State and private hospitals will have to follow the guidelines that the governments issue. Let me give you a picture across different states. In Haryana, 70 cases have been reported from Gurugram as of May 17. 5 people died of black fungus in Sirsa as reported just yesterday. In Delhi, over 160 cases have been reported so far. Dedicated black fungus centers are being set up in various hospitals in the national capital now. In Karnataka, 97 cases of black fungus reported till May 17th. In fact, there have been 174 cases and 17 deaths in Bengaluru till May 18th. In Gujarat, nearly 900 cases have been reported in the past month. In Ahmedabad, there are 481 patients admitted in hospitals for this disease right now. Maharashtra, even bigger number, 1,500 cases of black fungus reported, 90 deaths have been reported so far. Madhya Pradesh, 281 cases reported in the past 1 week. And then there is Rajasthan as well, another state that has already declared it as an epidemic. So let's try and understand, what are we looking at now? What is this big challenge staring at us? And are we ready to tackle this challenge? And I say good evening to Dr. Sanjay Pujari, Director of the Institute of Infectious Diseases in Pune, part of the National Task Force. Dr. S.K. Sarin, Director for Institute of Liver and Biliary Sciences from Delhi. Dr. Shashank Joshi, Dean, Indian College of Physicians, Leelavati Hospital, member of the Maharashtra COVID-19 Task Force. Dr. Yudhavir Singh, Consultant, Anesthesia and Critical Care at AIIMS. Dr. Rajesh Parekh, Director for Medical Research at Jaslok Hospital and author of the vaccine book, also joining us this evening. Let me actually start off with Dr. Sanjay Pujari. Dr. Pujari, for our viewers to understand what changes in terms of handling a disease when we notify it under the Epidemics Act?
Well, first of all, once you have Epidemic Act declared, it's compulsory to notify that a disease, for example, tuberculosis, cholera, diphtheria are already notifiable diseases in India, and so now mucormycosis becomes a notifiable disease. Secondly, the infrastructure needed as well as the capacity to respond to the epidemic of an infection like this needs to be upgraded very rapidly and needs to be implemented in a systematic way according to guidelines which are issued by the regulatory authorities. So essentially, it tries to have a uniform system of trying to tackle this epidemic of a fungal infection at the national level with a lot of coordination and administrative aspects being also taken care of under this act.
Okay, and is there a criteria? At what point do authorities usually decide that this is the step we need to take for a specific disease?
I'm sorry, I'm not able to tell that because I'm not really well versed with that aspect of what is the tipping point where you declare an infection as an epidemic. I think mostly if it becomes a public health problem
Okay.
and you see a number of cases coming in across the country simultaneously, then perhaps it's important to declare it as an epidemic. But I'm really not sure about what is the tipping point which is used by regulatory authorities.
Okay, let me ask Dr. Shashank Joshi also this question. Dr. Shashank Joshi, is there a criteria, is there a tipping point defined by the authorities that at this stage then we must say that this needs to be notified under the Epidemic Act or treated at a certain level?
So, Tanvi, there is no real definition that it has to have an absolute number. Anything which is rare, like mucor, also can be notifiable. So, notification has multiple purposes when there is a pandemic and a disaster. And they have utilized this so that, there is adequate reportage of a rare and unusual problem which can have a potential threat to life. If something is life-threatening, then it needs to be reported. And because mucor has a potential to be life-threatening, which is why probably it has been, that thinking has gone in the process so to make it notifiable. Because otherwise, we can notify a lot of other things like a tuberculosis or malaria. So some diseases come in that category. It necessarily need not be something which is communicable or must need to have a critical threshold. But also remember that it should understand that if there is a life-threatening potential to a particular problem, it may need notification, particularly in a pandemic time. So probably it is the reason why this has become notifiable is so that the authorities and the planners and the policymakers are notified about the problem and so that appropriate care can be taken of those individuals and also for the coverage purposes, sometimes to cover them under various schemes like, various schemes which the government rolls out. It is important to notify some diseases. So that probably is the logic because of which this could have been there.
Okay, fair enough. So let's talk about the disease itself and where we stand with more and more states reporting it. Over 20 states have now seen, quite a few number of cases. There have been fatalities in states like Maharashtra. Dr. Joshi, we have 90 deaths that have been reported so far. Now, for a viewer to understand, the first question anybody asks is, who's vulnerable? Who can get this disease and how?
If there's a single most important complication which makes you vulnerable is uncontrolled diabetes. After COVID, the COVID timetable is 14 to 21 days. But after that, the post-COVID timetable is usually there for 3 months or 100 days. And in those 100 days, if your glucose is high and it's swimming in 200 or 300, then you are susceptible to have a mucor-like issue. Particularly, even if you're not a diabetic, but if your glucose range is high, because there are 4 types of COVID and diabetes. Somebody who's diabetic who gets COVID, somebody who's pre-diabetic who gets COVID, somebody who is used steroids during COVID and probably can get diabetes because of that. And there is now recent evidence to show that COVID itself can cause diabetes. So that is the first thing. Second is use of steroids. And third is appropriate nasal and oral hygiene. Because if we are not able to maintain appropriate nasal and oral hygiene, then that is another cause of concern. Another postulated theory for the current mucor crisis also has been the sterile waters of the humidifiers for the oxygen mask. So all these put together make a perfect milieu for a very unusual and a rare fungus. And this is a mold fungus. This is a very difficult fungus to treat. And that is why it is very, very important to ensure that you need to be vigilant and alert and control diabetes tightly. And sometimes you need to use insulin as well. So controlling the glucose tightly is the first thing. Secondly, use steroids rationally and do not overdose them at all. And third thing is that be vigilant and pick the disease early and maintain an optimal oral, throat and nasal hygiene.
So Dr. Sarin, then, how do we define the use of steroids as rational use? And, otherwise there's just always going to be this fear in the minds of people. They don't know how much is being used. Is it the right amount? At what point is it being used?
Very important question, Tanvi. Normally, these steroids are as per guidelines for 5 to 10 days in hospitalized patients. Now, if you are using steroids at home, over the counter it is available, that is not fair and it is not justified. So in hospitalized patients who have moderate to severe disease under the supervision of a doctor, yes, steroids are given. Normally 10 days is the upper limit, but if there is a need by the doctor, it can be extended. Longer duration certainly can create problems. There has been a recent trend, people are giving extra heavy dosages of steroids, and that also is not as per guidelines, but maybe some prescriptions of a specialist. So justified dosages for fixed durations and also not too high dosages. And another important thing is that once a person is diabetic, in India about 10 to 12% are diabetic, 30% have fatty liver. If these people get steroids, their sugars can go high. And as 300, 200, as Dr. Shashank said, the levels are high. Sometimes they are 500. People are scared of getting onto insulin. So if the sugar is not controlled, is a problem. Another area where it is a concern, people in COVID are using masks, and there is a actual humidification all the time. Molds are everywhere. This mucor is present everywhere. If there is a construction going on, if the hospital is having some kind of activity there, mucor is everywhere. It will go into your nose, it will multiply and then create the problem. The use of steroids must be decreased if the patient is being discharged, and the patient must be clearly told, look, you may have these symptoms. So de-escalation of steroid dosage, correct monitoring. In fact, if you give them a glucometer, it might be as useful as giving them an oximeter. So you monitor your sugar. If you require, get onto the insulin. High levels will promote growth of this mold. So steroids must be very judiciously used. Then when we use so much of antibiotics, your immunity goes down and the fungus can grow. So people who are diabetic or pre-diabetic or obese or are under such situations, sometimes dialysis patients or kidney patients or liver patients, they all are predisposed to get this infection.
All right, so these are the people who are more vulnerable to getting this infection. I wanted to ask another question that we often, I often get asked this about online and even when we get the calls. Dr. Yudhavar Singh, maybe you can come in on this. When are we most vulnerable to it? While we have COVID, after we've recovered, and for how many days even after recovery are we vulnerable to black fungus?
Actually, most of the patients who are admitted in the hospitals, they are receiving steroids for long period. We have seen we are using steroids for long period in ICU because of their severity. So after COVID, the patients recovers. The main important thing is that we should de-escalate the steroid as soon as possible. And after discharging from the hospital, we have mostly the steroid is tapered, and the patients they are discharged from this hospital. So the risk of catching infection is during the steroid period, and after that it's almost about 2 weeks, 2 to 3 weeks is there. So the risk of infection of catching the fungal infection is in that vulnerable period. And the most important thing is that the dosing and duration of steroids should be regulated, and that is the most concern is there. And if the
so you're
patient
saying that it's largely, yes, go ahead please.
No, if the patient is advised steroid at home, so they should it should be properly guided. They should monitor the sugar level. They should maintain a safety hygiene as told by the earlier specialist. So this should be very, hygiene should be maintained. If the patient is discharged on the oxygen, so the sterile water should be used, because that can be a contaminated mucor can come through the water also. And if the patient is sent to home, they also use mask. Mask use also can prevent from the inhaling the fungus, because most of the fungal spores are coming through the air, and they should avoid the dusty environment. So 2 to 3 weeks period is vulnerable for catching the infection, because at that time the immunity is depressed.
Okay, so for 2 to 3 periods, even after you've otherwise recovered from COVID or have at least been discharged from the hospital and you're back home, because your immunity is still low, you need to be even more precautious, take all the kinds of precautions so as to avoid getting black fungus. Is that the kind of cases we are largely seeing, Dr. Parekh? Once people have gone home, that's when they have developed this? Or are we seeing larger cases that are happening in the hospital while they're already admitted?
Begin by the disclosure that I have not seen any cases. I direct medical research at JustLoc, so I cannot speak from personal experience. I also apologize to you for coming in a little late into the program. It's been a hectic day today, but I did have the opportunity to listen to the excellent words of my colleagues on this panel, and I must say they have comprehensively covered what we need to do. Let me now just simplify things a bit for our audience. First, while mucormycosis as an illness is very rare, the fungus, on the other hand, is paradoxically extremely common. It is all around us, it is in the soil, dust, air, and I dare say many of us already have it in our nasal cavities. Under usual circumstances, it does no harm. But in certain conditions, such as my colleagues have already amplified, constituting compromised immunity, either induced by the diabetes or COVID-19, or even by steroids, then if it goes out of control, it can be a dangerous disease indeed. Second, this is not in any way to minimize the significance of steroids in the treatment of COVID-19. Let us not get distracted in that. Let us never forget that steroids are probably the only effective treatment we have in our hands to deal with COVID. The issue with steroids is they have to be given at the right time, at the right dose, and in the right place. The right place, of course, being in a hospital under medical supervision. Why does this happen? Because steroids suppress immunity. So if people are in a rush to self-administer it, or when they have mild illnesses, it will suppress the immunity, increase the chances of COVID-19 and also of mucormycosis. However, when people are moderate to severely ill, the body's immune system is in overdrive. It is now beginning to hurt itself, particularly the lung. And that is where steroids have a phenomenally important role to play, given at the right dose, to slow down the immunity so the body is not at war with itself. And of course, this has to be done under medical supervision. So what I want to emphasize is, let us not give steroids a bad name. It's the rampant usage or misusage of steroids, both by the public and occasionally, I'm sorry to say, by medical professionals, which has allowed this disease to proliferate. Having said that, I know that this is no consolation to people who have lost dear ones from it, but it's very important for us not to lose focus of our bigger problem, which is COVID-19. Less than 100 people have died here. That's obviously, every death matters, but millions of people are dying through policy failures, which continue today in COVID-19. And that's what we need to act on immediately, while just ensuring that the public is well informed not to administer steroids themselves, and the medical profession also realizes the enormous strengths as well as limitations of steroid usage.
Oh, yes, absolutely. In fact, but the reason why we're also having this conversation and repeatedly raising questions is because we don't want another policy disaster leading to a bigger problem when it comes to black fungus. And I must admit to you, and specifically to you, Dr. Parekh, and to Dr. Pujari, I too seem to be a little off my game today. I know what you all are individually experts in, and I still seem to be throwing the wrong questions, at the wrong people here. But on the part that you raised, Dr. Parekh, about, of course, the exact use of steroids, to not dismiss the concept of steroids completely. Dr. Pujari, you and I have had conversations earlier as well, but maybe you would want to come in on this as well.
Yeah, so as I said previously in your program, I have a very effective statement for it. The use of steroids is important. It is one intervention which has shown to reduce mortality amongst patients who need respiratory support. That means they should be on oxygen. And it's the right dose at the right time in the right patient for the right duration. And the dose of steroid that is actually used in COVID-19, whether it is severe illness, including even if it is a severe illness, is 6 milligram of dexamethasone. So
Correct.
the temptation that when the disease increases and the severity increases, the temptation is to ramp up the dose. Well, that has not been found to be effective. In fact, trials have shown that high dose steroids are detrimental in treating COVID-19. As well as there has been studies which show that there is no benefit of extending steroids beyond 10 days. So essentially, if you benefit, you have to benefit it within 10 days. Beyond that, continuing steroids is not going to really benefit the patient from the COVID perspective. The third important thing, and the most, since you asked that question to Dr. Parikh, is what are the common patient populations that we see? Actually, most of the patients who come to us with the COVID associated mucormycosis have actually gone home, and they have gone home after recovering from their COVID, but the steroids are continued at home. They have hyperglycemia that is not being monitored and managed effectively because of either teleconsultation or inability to access healthcare, etc. And that leads to development of mucormycosis. Another important issue I have to mention is there is no evidence to suggest that you should be tapering steroids. When you use low dose steroids like this for a period of 10 days, you can suddenly stop it. There is a temptation that you need to lower the dose over a prolonged period of time. That is not needed. It is clinically not beneficial in tapering short dose, short duration, low dose steroids. So I think appropriate and judicious use of steroids is one of the most important aspects. Of course, mucor is something which is quite our country, though it is rare, is one of the countries which reports highest cases of mucormycosis in the world overall, in the absence of COVID also. So it's quite a disease which is prevalent in our community. It has been exaggerated. And why I say steroids and hyperglycemia are important, because of the two forms of mucormycosis, the involving the sinuses and the eyes, and other involves the pulmonary system. It's the sinonasal orbital eye involvement which is more commonly seen in this epidemic. And the reason for that is the commonest site in diabetic patients and patients with uncontrolled diabetes. So essentially, it looks to be the driving force for causing this form of mucormycosis in a country. So I would always tell people as well as physicians to please use steroids judiciously in the right dose, and that is very low dose, 6 milligram of dexamethasone or equivalent of methylprednisolone. Don't peg up the dose, don't taper the dose, use it for the right duration, 10 days. And most of these problems, and monitor sugars if hyperglycemia occurs, manage it efficiently. And most of these problems can be really prevented if we do that.
If I may, Tanvi.
But you said something in just 1 minute, Dr. Parikh. I'm just coming back to you, but because Dr. Pujari said something in the first part of his answer, that people continue using steroids once they've been discharged and they've gone home. Now, how is this happening? Isn't this then a big concern because somebody is prescribing them those steroids that they seem to be self-medicating then or self-taking? Dr. Pujari?
So usually this happens because of the temptation to taper it off. So these people, they finish their steroid course in the hospital and then they go home, they're tapering the steroids gradually over a period of 1 or 2 weeks. And the hyperglycemia is also something which occurs simultaneously, and that is unfortunately not monitored and managed efficiently. So I think if you look at data, the data is very clear. You need to use steroids either for a period of 10 days or until discharge. It's very clear in the recovery trial. After discharge, you don't need to use steroids.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Rajesh Parikh.
Yeah, well, I was just anxious to compliment Dr. Pujari. That is the most beautiful explanation that I have come across in recent times, both on the fungus and the steroid. What it quite simply tells us that with steroids, we follow the law of diminishing returns, that we should just remember less is more. If we overshoot, we then enter into a zone which is very dangerous for the patients. And as he correctly pointed out, I would have forgotten to bring it up. I'm glad he brought it up, that beyond 10 days, it is absurd to continue the dose. And the third thing I want to add, again in defense of steroids, Tanvi, is, steroids are an orphan drug. They are a generic drug. They are unbelievably cheap in our country. No pharmaceutical benefits from it. Nobody has an axe to grind. And therefore, very few people are willing to speak up for steroids when they are the most effective treatment we have. On the other hand, when due to their misusage, side effects like this are caused, a lot of people, particularly pharmaceutical, are ready to pick up cudgels and blame the drug rather than the people who are administering it, and even more often than that, the people who are self-consuming it.
All right. Okay, fair enough. Dr. Shashank Joshi, do you wanted to add?
Yeah, there are two things which nobody should forget. Number one, steroids when indicated in moderate and severe disease for COVID is one part. But also remember, a large proportion of COVID also lands up after severe COVID with lung fibrosis. And our pulmonary physicians do use steroids in long term as a treatment for the lung fibrosis, which is a structural disease and of the lungs. And there, monitoring the sugars, getting a sugar testing machine at home, using insulin, giving them some devotion and time for those 3 months is crucial. At the same time, judicious use of nebulized steroids as well as supervised steroids is equally important. We are now closely auditing every case of the Mucor in the state of Maharashtra. And we have observed that many of them have very bad lungs or a brutal lung disease. And therefore, it is not fair to say that steroids are only misused. Sometimes they are appropriately used, but the glucose is not monitored. So if you ask me, it's an unholy trinity of high glucose with, of course, steroid use. And if there is a patient who has diabetes with steroid use, then if you maintain appropriate nasal and oral and throat hygiene with proper iodine drops and gargling, etc., you can actually prevent a lot of mucor formation itself. So I think it is all about supervised care and supportive care for those 2 to 3 months, which are crucial, including monitoring glucose, which is the key to prevent. The idea is to prevent, because once you get the disease, you have exotic drugs and surgery where our dental, ENT, neurosurgical or ophthalmological colleagues get involved. And I think we need to avoid that. And therefore, it is very important to recognize that leave it to specialist care. Ensure that your specialist, it's a multidisciplinary approach, even in the post-COVID times, between those 3 weeks and 3 months. And that's for monitoring glucose, ensuring that appropriate oral, throat and nose hygiene, and over and above that, ensuring that judicious use of steroids under a pulmonologist supervision is extremely crucial and critical if we want to prevent this so-called. And also this black fungus is a misnomer. It doesn't have anything black inside it. In fact, there is different fungus with black part, and therefore that term also should not be used routinely. It is mucormycosis, and mucor has nothing black in it.
Okay, so mucormycosis it is. Dr. Joshi, I just wanted to ask you a follow-up question before we let you go on this conversation is about what do we do now? How do we have to prepare ourselves? Is there apart from obviously ensuring that we do an optimal proper use of steroids, but outside of that, there has been much conversation about the drug which is there, in the market available, but that may not be enough. The government has now given approval to 5 more pharma companies to get for this new drug, but obviously that will take some time for all of that to hit the markets. What are the key things that policymakers in various states will have to now prepare for and arrange?
I think we have to rationalize and we have to prevent, and we have to keep on educating our medical community and as well as people at large. And I think that is happening both at central and state government level, and we are ensuring that we have it is a multidisciplinary approach. So all the ENT surgeons having a dedicated ward, having multidisciplinary approach, including nursing care, is all being looked at, ensuring that sterile water is used, ensuring that the humidifiers are appropriately maintained. So it is a lot of education which is required to the respective stakeholders, and that is the key. And also ensuring that the availability of drugs, including liposomal amphotericin, which you are saying, which will now be triaged in an appropriate way. It will be again centralized like various other drugs which we have seen in COVID times, and both from center and state, and we will have to rationally use them in the most deserving cases. And also many of them will need surgical treatment.
Yes, they, many of them will need surgical treatment. That's also something that the hospitals and the states will have to now factor in. Dr. Sarin, would you want to comment on this as well? Already, for example, in the national capital, they've identified specific hospitals which will have dedicated, centers for mucormycosis, even in a couple of other cities. Now, what is required in terms of preparation at these places?
One or two things about the patients. The patient gets the nasal stuffiness and has a discharge and loss of sensation sometimes. So I think the patients must also learn to report that they have a problem or there is a swelling in the nose or in the eye. I think sometimes if you are at home and you do not know, please report. Second, if in the hospital, the doctors can easily diagnose by putting in a swab, and it is a KOH swab, and you can find out it is a fungus, and then of course for biopsy. Now, the problem is once, and Delhi has almost got 200 plus patients. I think Maharashtra, Mumbai, they have more than 600. So if this is the way, next 3 weeks may be difficult for everyone because of this. And there is a need for a combined team. The team would include an ENT guy. It will need an ophthalmologist, a neurologist, a pulmonary care, and of course, an internal medicine. Now, all these people are required for what? Because the fungal drug, antifungal drug does not reach inside. Till the time you scrap, you remove the crust, then only, and for that you require a special surgical skill, orofacial surgeons, they can do that. And that's not easily available. So where do the patients go? And it is for this reason that I think the government of Delhi has put up 3 hospitals. And I would suggest every COVID hospital which has COVID beds should have this facility so that patients can get the debridement, the removal of the fungus, and the drugs can come. You're very right that there is a paucity of drug. And nobody thought that this drug would be required. So a judicious use of amphotericin B, liposomal, is required, but don't get panicked. The quantity is large, it shouldn't go into black marketing and all that. But if it is rationally used for patients who are requiring it, and I think in few days there can be an increased production, we can save lives. But most important is prevention. Second, it is early detection and diagnosis, and of course treatment. And one more thing is that if this amphotericin is not available, liposomal, you can have the standard amphotericin. You can have other drugs which are available. It is slightly more toxic for the kidney, but don't get panicked that, well, we don't have it, so the patient will die. Oral tablets are also available. They are not as effective. So there is treatment, but yes, it is a very serious disease. If not taken care in time, the mortality can be 50% to even 100%. So I think specialized units to handle it are required. Every COVID place, a large center, must have mucormycosis set up to handle these patients.
Actually, you made a very valid point, and I was going to make that my next question. Dr. Rajesh Parekh, what are the key symptoms that somebody who's, vulnerable, recovered from COVID back at home should be watching out for?
Oh, that's very simple. Let me also say what you should not worry about, because I get calls for that all the time. Please do not worry about fatigue. It takes a long, long time to settle down. Please do not get too worried about smell and taste. They too take days and occasionally weeks to settle down. But if there is a recurrence of symptoms that one has gone through earlier, other than these, the symptoms from which one has already recovered, then it's a cause for concern. Breathing rates are a cause for concern. Fever is a cause for concern. Severe headaches are a cause for concern. But they're a cause for concern, mind you, and not for panic. But there is another issue, and if you have a couple of minutes, I'd like to bring it up now. If not, perhaps we could do it some other time.
No, go ahead, please.
Okay, so this is my heartfelt advice to my colleagues who are policymakers. It involves 3 organs: the brain, the eyes, and the heart. In our brains, we should never forget the oath we took, which was utmost loyalty to our patient. The patient in front of us matters more than any government official, however highly placed, and our duty is to that patient. As far as the eyes are concerned, my request to all policymakers is please take that mask off your eyes, put it where it appropriately belongs. See those dead bodies flowing down the Ganga and the riverbanks, and think of the larger cause. And if you do that, the third related to your heart, and that is get the fear out of your heart. If you are dedicated to your patients and dedicated to the profession in whom you took an oath and which has benefited you so much in life, you will not be afraid of politicians, you will not be afraid of your next promotion, and maybe you may not get the next award that you're dangling for, but you would have served humanity and you would have done your job intelligently and fearlessly. And that today is the most important decision we need to make ourselves in dealing with this pandemic.
But Dr. Parekh, what is the hesitancy? What is the fear there? I mean, internally, as all the experts who do have conversations and interact and advise various governments, whatever recommendations they make, they're making those recommendations. They're advising the government. Whether the policy makers finally follow it and implement it and take those decisions is up to the governments, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I am not singling any particular party. I am not privy to what advice was given and what was discarded in the dustbin and what was followed. But I think it's amply clear to everybody that this has been an enormous failure on all fronts. For example, now I have written 2 books, one last February. I've checked over 1,500 references, papers, and books. And for over a year, Tanvi, on your program and others, I have been warning about the second wave and how much more devastating that it could be compared to the first wave. This has been very, very clear. I've been screaming my voice hoarse on universal vaccination since December. So I am not sure whether the right advice is being given or whether once it is given, it is being discarded. But whatever it is, I feel if we look at this pandemic, not in terms of numbers, to think that every illness, every death matters, and our loyalty is to every person in our country who is either falling ill or who might fall ill, then we might be able to reduce this enormous chasm between science and policy. I mean, right now it looks like they're in 2 completely different directions.
Yeah. Yeah, I do agree with you on what it seems like to us from here, and I hope that actually the gap between the two, the scientific experts and the medical experts and the policymakers really completely reduces, and there's absolutely no gap, because if we have the experts who know what is happening, what's going to happen, that's all the policymakers really need to listen to and accordingly implement rules, regulations, make arrangements, cater to the people's lives. Now, picking up from that point, and let me also say good evening to Dr. Anup Amarnath, Chairman for the Geriatric Medicine Manipal Hospitals, member of the Critical Care Support Unit for Government of Karnataka, joining me right now. Dr. Amarnath, just before this conversation with Dr. Parekh, we were also talking about the available drugs for the black fungus, for treating mucormycosis, what we have right now, what is expected in the market. But I wanted to ask you this question. What are the lessons that we've learned from the kind of shortage and chaos that we saw with Remdesivir that we can implement here? The lessons learned there that we implement here so that the same problem crisis doesn't emerge again.
Absolutely. I think the logistics of medicines management is an important aspect over here. And what we've also seen is that with the shortage of amphotericin, I think we will have to look into what are the alternatives available and can we use any preventive medications for that. So yes, the answer to that is yes. You have medicines, antifungals like isavuconazole, which we are using on the ground. There is also the availability of posaconazole, another antifungal medicine which we're using. So we will have to look into these alternatives and not just wait until amphotericin is available. So that's number one. I think the other, a few more very important points. We've been discussing about steroids. There have been a lot of patients, say for example, rheumatoid arthritis patients who've been on steroids for ages, but then we don't tend to see this kind of fungal infection there. 3 specific things that I would like to make a note here. Number one, the quality of oxygen. There was a mad scramble for oxygen, as we all know, industrial oxygen being moved to medical oxygen. We really need to look into what is the role that is playing, and this is where the biomedical engineers come into the picture, the quality of oxygen that is being given. Number 2, is there a strong correlation between the specific strain, the B1617, which we're seeing, and then with mucormycosis? That's something which we really need to look into. There is also a lot of evidence on the ground that we're seeing with increased ferritin levels in the body and mucormycosis, because we know that mucor feeds on ferritin. So that's something which we really need to look into much more deeply. And the reason I'm saying that is because of the third point, is this preventable? Can antifungals be used to prevent this? Somebody who's at high risk, in the sense that who's on high doses of steroids, on humidified oxygen, these are the kind of cases which are more predisposed to mucor. So what's our preventive strategy? Can we put them on antifungals? I think these 3 points, the quality of oxygen, the correlation between the strain and mucormycosis, and the preventive strategy, I think these 3 are very important things that we need to strongly look into.
All right, I am just, I'm just deviating for a bit, but I'm just reading, the latest WHO comment that's come in, stating that they suspended the Gilead Sciences antiviral drug Remdesivir. That was part of their list as of now. But they have, in an email response to Reuters, the WHO spokesperson has said that we've suspended it from the pre-qualification list. The suspension is a signal to countries that WHO, in compliance with treatment guidelines, does not recommend countries to procure the drug for COVID. And of course, we will wait to see what our own government and authorities' final comment on this is. But Dr. Pujari, if this is the decision or view of the WHO, is it larger research which is available across the world that seems to suggest that Remdesivir is not helpful at all?
Yeah, so when you look at clinical trials for Remdesivir, there are just 4 trials which have been of reasonably good quality, which have looked at it. And there is a meta-analysis which combines data from all these trials. And there are 4 or 5 meta-analysis which have been done by different groups. WHO also does its own meta-analysis. And based on that, WHO had already recommended some time ago that there is no evidence to suggest that Remdesivir really works in hospitalized patients, because they basically had this Solidarity trial, which is one of the largest trials where they demonstrated this effect as well. And then there are some other meta-analysis also which suggest that Remdesivir is not really useful. If you look at international guidelines, particularly guidelines in the US from the NIH or from the Infectious Disease Society of America, they recommend Remdesivir only in patients who need respiratory support for a period of 5 days, and there is no 28-day mortality benefit associated with Remdesivir in any of the trials. So there is a shorter time to clinical recovery from 15 days to 10 days that was demonstrated in one of the pivotal trials called the ACT-1 trial. Apart from that, really, there is very limited use of Remdesivir. Unfortunately, Remdesivir was used extensively in India. Even before patients needed respiratory support, prolonged durations as well. So I think the evidence for Remdesivir is really going down, particularly in terms of, there was no evidence for mortality benefit anyway, but even in terms of time to clinical recovery, the evidence is of very low certainty. We call that in our grade recommendation. It's we are not really confident about the effect that we are seeing, even with the time to clinical recovery. So I think WHO coming out, of course, since you told this, I have not seen this information, but WHO obviously will follow its own guidelines, and WHO doesn't recommend Remdesivir.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. As we're just going through this information that's just come in right now. In fact, I am also completely out of time. So a big thank you to all of the panelists who joined us on this conversation with their views and comments, and helping us with their insights as far as mucormycosis is concerned. One big new challenge that we are staring at in our war against COVID, like one of the experts on the panel said, let's not forget that there is still a larger battle to fight, which is the second wave of COVID. And this itself is giving birth to a lot more cases of the black fungus. people who are diabetic, who have liver conditions, those are the ones who are more vulnerable. People who have lower immunity are more vulnerable. Of course, even after you have been discharged from the hospital and you're back home and recovering from COVID, you're still vulnerable for the few weeks. So you have to be careful, watch out. Watch out for the amount of steroids you're being given or you are taking yourself. That is one of the biggest factors. All experts agree on that. One of the biggest factors is overconsumption of steroids during treatment of COVID. So while it is a very strong tool to treat COVID, it is also something when used in excessive amounts that could lead to black fungus. Thank you so much for joining us.